Good morning to each of you, and welcome to our Sunday school class. We're going to be studying the book of Daniel here today. We've already had our time of prayer. Just to go over a little bit on the agenda for today, what we're looking to do, I am hoping to finish the book of Daniel by Christmas. I said that last time about our Women in the Bible study, and it took us through July. But this time I'm really going to try hard to have us finished by Christmas. So today, what we want to do, we want to introduce the book of Daniel, and we also want to introduce the historical context. What has happened around the book of Daniel? That means getting into verses 1 and 2. We want to talk about those verses and what it means. Our objective for today, which means if you know this stuff, you will have succeeded in learning in the Sunday school class, and I will have succeeded in teaching. We want to be able to know when Daniel was written. We also want to understand the historical context, at least just a little bit. What's happened when we enter the book of Daniel? What's going on? So if you can answer those questions, that will be excellent. The commentaries that I'm using to study this book are two, using Joyce Baldwin's Tyndale commentary called Daniel, an Introduction and Commentary. I'm also using John Goldingay's Word Biblical Commentary on Daniel. So those are the two references that when I make a quote from something, I'll be saying one of those two names and referencing them. So first things first, when was Daniel written? There's some interesting things about the book of Daniel that we need to know just going on that are different from our normal Old Testament books. Does anybody know what language almost every Old Testament book is written in? Yeah, excellent. It's written in Hebrew. Every Old Testament book is written in Hebrew. It's later translated into Greek, which is called the Septuagint, but that is the first translation. So every book is written in Hebrew. Daniel is the exception. Daniel chapter 1 verse 1 through Daniel chapter 2 verse 4 is all in Hebrew. Then from chapter 2 verse 4 through chapter 7 is in Aramaic. Then from chapter 7 to the end is back in Hebrew. Okay, so there's a little bit of an exception here with the book of Daniel. A good chunk of the middle section is actually written in Aramaic. Why? Well, Babylon spoke Aramaic. Okay, in Babylon, the Babylonians, they spoke mostly Aramaic. What this means for us is we're able to date the book a little bit closely based on the Aramaic, and the Aramaic words, we're able to kind of date when the book was written. Now, older scholarship, so you go back 40, 50 years, and some scholars even today, will argue for a very late date of writing the book of Daniel. Okay? The events in the book of Daniel happen somewhere between 605 BC and 537 BC. We're going to get into that in a few minutes. Some people will say that the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, somewhere between 200 and 100 BC, about 300 years after the event. Can anybody guess why that might be the case? Why would people date it so late? It's dated so late. Let me see here if I can find the passage. Dated so late because of Daniel chapter 7 and the events beyond that. So Daniel chapter 7 is a vision about 4 beasts. Each beast represents an empire. Okay? And it talks about what happens to those empires and to those beasts. And later on, then it continues to talk about different kings in the language of animals. It is that those visions are so accurate that modern scholarship, many days going back 50 years and all the way up to, probably about, even up to today, depending on what scholar you read, those visions are so accurate, they said that they could not be written except for after the fact. Now, what is the fundamental error with believing that a vision would only be so accurate that it had to be written after the fact? What's the fundamental underlying error in that line of thinking? That way. Here's the fundamental underlying error, though. Fundamental error is that God doesn't know the future. If God knows the future, then of course he can give a vision 300 years in advance and have it be perfectly accurate. Right? So the issue with modern day scholarship is actually about a belief in the power of God and knowledge of God. That's the issue. Okay? So if we believe that God can and knows the future, then we believe that he would be able to give visions hundreds of years in advance and have them be accurate. What else? Where else does God display that kind of foreknowledge of events?
The birth of Jesus.
Perfect. The birth of Jesus, right? The prophet Isaiah, about 700 years, 650 years in advance, talks about the virgin birth of Jesus. The book of Genesis, chapter 1, the proto-gospel, the first gospel ever given, right? If we'll just read it for you. Genesis chapter, it's not Genesis chapter 1, it's Genesis chapter 3. God says this, verse 15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What's that talking about? That's actually talking about the Messiah overcoming and defeating Satan. So God can give any amount of foreknowledge to a prophet or to anybody that he wants to, right? That's God's prerogative. Okay. Now here's the thing that's interesting. Going back to what we were originally talking about with the language. According to Joyce Baldwin in her commentary, the Aramaic can fit any time period between the 6th century and the 2nd century. Any time period. Which means the Aramaic can be an early date. There's a second thing that would then suggest that the book was written early on by about 500 BC, that it was written early on, is because there are no Greek loan words in the book. There's not a tremendous amount of Greek loan words. What's a loan word? When we talk about English, what's a loan word? Let's talk about something that you might know. When somebody sneezes, what do you say? Just shout it out. Somebody sneezes. What is it? Gesundheit. Gesundheit. What language is that from?
I think it's
German. Yeah. Or what? Dutch? You said? Yeah, it's German or Dutch. It's a loan word, right? It's something that's borrowed from another language that has become commonplace in ours. What are some others? Does anybody know what language we get cookie from? Cookie is a modification of a German word, Kuchen. Okay? Cookie. It's a loan word from another language that then's been made to fit into English. Right? We have other loan words. Right? What's the local factory here? Honda. Where's Honda from?
Japan.
It's a Japanese company, right? That's become modern parlance in America because there's a manufacturer named after it. Guess what? That's a loan word, right? It's not American, it's Japanese, right? So we have these loan words in languages. Well, by the 2nd century, about 150 at the late, I think it's earlier than that. It's got to be between 200 BC and 150 BC. Greek had conquered Judea and Persia down to Babylon, the whole region. Which means if it was written late, there would have been Greek loan words in the text. and a lot of them. Why? Well, it's dominated, and the language of the day was Greek. Okay, so this actually suggests to us that was written at an early date before there was a lot of Greek culture overtaking the region. Okay, so it argues for a date between 537 BC, about 400 BC. So an early date for the writing of the story. Alrighty, so all this is pretty important. When was the book written? Early. Thinking about 500 BC, very early on. Okay. Here's the second thing that's really, really cool about it needing to be an early date. Does anybody know what Qumran, the Qumran community, is famous for? A modern day discovery. Community at Qumran is famous for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Anybody listen to our lecture from John Byron, who came about a year ago and did a lecture on the scriptures, and he talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are now our earliest manuscripts of the original Old Testament, including the Great Scroll of Isaiah. Well, guess what's found in those scrolls? Like fragments of the book of Daniel. Fragments of the book of Daniel. Now, they preserved a lot of material, especially material that they believed was canonical, meaning within the Old Testament. And so they preserved copies of the book of Daniel. What does that mean for us? Well, if the book of Daniel was just written in 200 BC, and it's already found in the Qumran community just a few decades later, why would they think it was scripture? Right? The book has just been written. Okay, but if it's been around a few hundred years, it would naturally be taken as a part of the scriptural context by that community. Okay, again, an argument for that early date of the writing of Daniel. So when was it written? Somewhere around 500 BC. Okay, in that ballparkish. Okay. What questions do you have for me? Alrighty. Let's go into our context then. So let's read a little bit in the book of Daniel. Can anybody read for me Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 2?
Just 1 and 2?
Just 1 and 2.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Excellent, thank you. So immediately, just reading those verses, what are some things that you know about the historical context? About what's going on in history when the events of Daniel are taking place? Look especially at verse 1. What's happened?
Babylon's taken over Judah.
Yeah, excellent. Babylon has taken over Judah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. If you have a map, now would be a good time to pull it out in the back of your Bible. I have one here. If you don't, I'll be happy to pass around my atlas. I do highly recommend having an atlas for studies at home. However, I have also an amazing Matthew drawing of the area. We all know how good I am at drawing. And so I have happily drawn a map of the area for us. Okay? This is not to scale, and it's probably not even geographically correct, but it'll give you a little bit of the pointers, right? So starting in on the region, you have the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? Egypt is down here. Egypt is an important power. Egypt is going to be basically the cause of King Josiah's death. Who's King Josiah?
Is he the king of Judah or Israel?
All right, yeah, he was the king of Judah. You're correct. So the empire has been, the Israeli kingdom has long been split. The northern tribes are already gone into exile by Assyria. They're already pulled up. They're already gone. At this time, the king Josiah is ruler of Jerusalem, and the Egyptian king comes up this way and is around, I think, Megiddo, in order to confront the king of Babylon. King Josiah is actually a servant of the king of Babylon, goes out to fight Pharaoh Necho. Pharaoh kills King Josiah. Okay? Then he comes and he conquers Jerusalem. He is the one who names King Jehoiakim. Okay, this is Josiah's son. This is Josiah's son. Okay, he renames him. When a king is renamed, that means that the power, that the conquering empire has power over that king. Okay? So, right now in Daniel chapter 1, what we've experienced is the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, comes from way over here. I mean, I drew the map so poorly in that it's off the screen. Okay, it's going to be way over here. He's already conquered Assyria. He comes and defeats Egypt rather soundly. And then he comes down and he's going to be besieging Jerusalem. He's reconquering the area. He's going to destroy Jerusalem. And that is what's happening in verse 1. He's besieged it. This takes place in about 605 BC. 605 BC. Okay? This is the so-called first exile of Judah. Okay? What questions do you have for me? Now, if you don't get all this, you don't have to. I just want you to remember that the goal is just to understand basic context. Basic historical context. What do we see then in verse 2? Daniel chapter 1, verse 2. What do we see?
He went. He took over the vessels of the temple.
Yeah. So King Nebuchadnezzar takes over some of the vessels of the temple, carries them off, as well as basically the vessels of the house. That's where we are in verse 2. To the land of Shinar. Now, wait a second. Isn't the King Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon? So what's this deal with the Shinar language?
Isn't that another name for that?
Bingo. That's another name for Babylon. Okay? Shinar is specifically, according to John Goldingay, specifically, the name Shinar specifically suggests a place of false religion, self-will, and self-aggrandizement. Does anybody know, just from that language, self-will, false religion, self-aggrandizement, where else in Scripture we might have heard of Shinar in connection with Babylon? You got it? Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. Right? Remember the Tower of Babel they're building? That's in the land of Shinar. Okay, that's where all the languages get confused and the tower is left off and they go from there. Okay? It's also mentioned one other place in a sermon series we did, I lose track of time, a year ago, with Zechariah. Okay? Wickedness is carried off in a basket, remember, to the land of Shinar. Okay, so those are two of the places that word is linked. Alrighty. What questions do you have for me? I want to slow down just a moment. What questions do you have for me? Or what comments do you have?
Is this when the temple was destroyed for the first time?
Great. This is a good question. Is this when the temple is destroyed the first time? Actually, no. There are approximately 3 exiles of the people of Judah. One happens in 605 BC. The second happens in 597 BC. Okay? The third happens in 587 BC. And it's on that last one that the temple is burnt and destroyed. So it's about 15 years after this that it's destroyed.
So is this 3 different conquering powers that do these 3?
Is it 3 different conquering powers in the land of Judah? No, it's actually all Babylon. Babylon comes, conquers them, takes off some of the temples. Actually, they keep a king for a while. That king rebels against Babylon. Babylon comes and conquers them again. Then they rebel again, and Babylon comes and razes the whole place. The temple, Jerusalem, tears down the walls, everything. They've had enough at that point. So where we are in the book of Daniel, though, is just after that first exile. After the first exile.
How do you define some of the vessels of the house of God?
How do we define some of the vessels of the house of God? We don't know for sure, but in Daniel chapter 4, there's like a plenitude of things that they've taken, like cups, plates, utensils, probably some of the furnishings. The things that are not taken are the really big stuff. The bronze sea that Solomon had made, carried on calves used for ritual washings. The big stuff is not taken. Okay. The Ark of the Covenant is actually probably already gone at this point. It was most likely taken by one of the first times Egypt ransacked the place. So the Ark is at this point long gone. But some scholars will argue that the Ark is taken to Babylon at this point. We just don't know. Now, so I've just dumped for 20 minutes on you. Do you want to go further, or do you want to pull it back just a little bit and just kind of go some more surface level things? It's up to you. You want to go, let me specifically say, do you want to go deeper on the dating and some of the dating issues that we have here and how those are resolved? Or would you like to talk about some of the theology, some of the ideas that would be going around Judah at this time and around the exiles? Which would you rather do? Leave it up to you. The second. Okay, sure enough. So let's focus in on verse 2. Okay. The author says, or Daniel, who's most likely the author, Daniel tells us who is in control of this situation of Babylon sacking Jerusalem. Who's in control?
Wouldn't it be Nebuchadnezzar?
Look carefully at verse 2. Who is in control of the situation?
Jehoiakim.
What's that?
Jehoiakim.
Nope, Jehoiakim is not in control either. The Lord, exactly. Look, and it says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. The Lord is fully in charge. So the author of Daniel is saying, look, God is sovereign in handing over his own people to a foreign power, Babylon. Okay? That's who's in charge. What thought pattern or whose thought pattern does that align with? That God is sovereign and is giving his own people into the hands of the enemy. Whose thought pattern is that in line with in the Old Testament? Don't overthink this one. Let me rephrase the question. Who proclaims that this exile is going to happen and that God is going to hand his people over into the hands of the king of Babylon? Who proclaims it from the hilltops and from the temple? Who shouts it?
I would say a prophet, but
Exactly, the prophets, right? This is directly in line with what the prophets have been saying. Specifically, Isaiah, specifically Jeremiah, right? Both of those prophets are shouting out that this is going to happen. There are some so-called minor prophets that are also telling us these things, right? Directly in line with, okay? What do you think some of the people are thinking?
Probably wondering who's going to be in control.
Yeah, some of the people are asking who is really in control. If the Lord couldn't defend his own house, then this other god, the gods of Babylon, must be more powerful. Why else would his stuff be taken for use in their sanctuaries in Babylon? You see how the lines of thought work among the lay people and among the prophets. They're in two very different spheres of thinking. Comment or question?
I just find it hard. You said that the ark would have already been gone.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But when you read, I've been reading in Exodus, the detail of making that ark, and it had to be perfect.
Yeah.
And so it strikes me as very odd that the Lord would just let that go.
Yeah. The detail of the ark had to be perfect when it was made.
Yeah.
Right? And the ark operated as what for God? In Israelite theology. What was that?
Like a representative of God in
representative of God, close. They would have thought that that was God's throne, that God existed above it in the most holy of holies, that's his throne area. Okay? Let me see if I can find this reference really quickly for us. And it surprises us then that God would let that go. Here's the thing. Why do you think God would have let the Ark of the Covenant go?
I wonder if he didn't feel like he was their God anymore, and didn't have the value that it had originally made.
Yeah. So he's indicating and signposting to them that he was no longer their God, that they had betrayed him to such an extent that the ark was going away. Good. So that's one aspect. What's another aspect? How do the psalmists and how does Jesus reframe where God's throne is?
In each of us, inside of us.
So we operate as God's temple. That's by the power of the Holy Spirit. But many of the psalmists and things would say that the earth is God's footstool and the heavens are his throne. Right? So God is allowing the ark to go because ultimately he's teaching his people something else. That the ark is not the place where he is confined. Right? Nor is Zion going to be impenetrable merely because they have the ark there. No. Merely because Zion has the ark, merely because Zion has the temple, there is something far more important than the mere object. Just like there's something far more important than the mere sacrifice. Let's go over that analogy. What is more important than the mere sacrifice on the altar?
Intent.
Intent, close. Yeah, it's something along the lines of intent. What else?
God looks at the heart.
God looks at the heart, so it's not merely intent, but what is it? Righteousness. Right? The psalmists say, act with righteousness and then your sacrifice will be honored. What do I want? I want a sacrifice of thanksgiving and praise from the heart. I don't want mere cows on the altar, or mere oxen, or mere pigeons. That's not nearly enough. In the same way, it is not merely enough to have the ark in Zion, in the temple. What is needed for the ark to actually matter? We just talked about what the ark meant. What is needed? God's presence. God's presence is needed. Okay? Without God's presence, the ark doesn't matter. It's just a golden box. It is God who makes it holy, not the box itself.
So when the ark was taken, whenever it was taken, did the people see that as a sign of God leaving them in a way, or?
The prophets announced that. And I just found the reference, so thank you for pulling us back into that. Turn with me to Jeremiah chapter 3. Jeremiah chapter 3. From Daniel, you're just going to go left. You're going to hit Ezekiel, then Lamentations, then you're in Jeremiah. If you hit Isaiah, you've gone too far. Psalms, too far. Okay, so you're going to head left. Jeremiah is a big book, so you should be able to find Jeremiah chapter 3. This is when most scholars will say, or some scholars will say, that the ark was lost at least by this date. Now, it's very early on in Jeremiah's ministry. Jeremiah is the main prophet declaring the exile of Judah to Babylon. Look here in verse 15 and 16 and 17. And I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will feed you with knowledge and understanding. And when you have multiplied and been fruitful in the land, in those days, declares the Lord, they shall no more say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind, or be remembered, or missed. It shall not be made again. Well, this is before the exile has happened to Babylon, and it is, it's prophesying a time after the return of the exiles from Babylon back to Judah. So, what are they saying, even in this moment? The ark of the covenant of the Lord, where is it? We miss it so much. Why? The temple is still around. So that means it must have been ransacked or plundered or taken before Babylon comes. Most likely, that's what we think. Okay, which means Egypt most likely took it. Remember Raiders of the Lost Ark? How it's in Egypt? Well, this is partly where that comes from. All right. Now, most likely it's not around, hidden somewhere. Okay, but most likely it was taken to Egypt. It could be that it was taken to Babylon in the first exile, but it's most likely taken to Egypt and was destroyed. Okay. And unfortunately I didn't note the other passage. There's another passage in Kings which links the time that Egypt came and conquered, but I didn't have that noted here for my memory. I'll have to go back and look it up. All right. What questions or comments do we have there?
Did Isaiah and Jeremiah prophesy after the northern kingdom was already dismantled?
Did Isaiah and Jeremiah prophesy before the northern kingdom was dismantled? Jeremiah is after the northern kingdom is dismantled, clearly. Jeremiah is a young man when he starts. And he starts to prophesy in King Josiah's time. Okay? King Hezekiah, who is King Josiah's grandfather, is the one who witnessed the northern kingdom being destroyed. Isaiah ministered in that period. So Isaiah ministered during, and he prophesied the expulsion of the northern kingdoms. And then he ministered to Hezekiah and also prophesied Babylon coming in. Okay?
So part of Jeremiah's message must have been, look, guys, you see what happened to the northern kingdoms. be aware, this could so easily happen to you as well.
Yeah. That's part of Jeremiah's message. You've got it. And actually, part of Jeremiah's message after the fact is, actually, the northern kingdom was more honest than you. The northern kingdom did their idolatry full blown and were honest about it. The Judeans covered it up. They had their idolatry, and they wouldn't admit it. And they said, no, we're still righteous, even though they had idols even in the temple. And so Jeremiah's message is actually partly, northern Israel was more faithful than you, O faithless Judah. Yep. All right. So now there's one more major prophet to dovetail in here then. Ezekiel. So-called major prophet Ezekiel. When does Ezekiel minister? Ezekiel begins his ministry in exile, in the land or going to the land of Babylon. And he's the major prophet of the exiles. That's when Ezekiel is ministering. So you see some overlap between Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Okay? That was just a freebie for you. Tossed in there. All right, let's head back to the book of Daniel. We have just a few more minutes. Now, I want you to say I'm so proud of us today. We've actually already tackled our whole agenda. So the rest of it we'll just recap next week too. We've introduced the book of Daniel. We've talked about the historical context. Book of Daniel was written 500 BC. Signpost that for us. Around 500 BC. Okay, it's probably done. Understand historical context. We're around at the beginning 605 BC with the exile. Okay? Boom, bada boom. You can remember this. We've been successful today. Hallelujah. That's all I want you to really remember. If you can remember these things, we're good to go. Okay? We go into detail. Detail is good and helpful for those who can catch it. But I want you to know the main points. Boom, bada boom. Okay, if you're out the door with that, we're happy. I'm happy. Don't want you to get overwhelmed. Right? We're doing a lot. Don't want people overwhelmed. This is what's going to count going forward.
Is this a time when lots of things have been written about this time period, or is Daniel one of just a few books written about this period?
Have lots of books been written about this period? It
No,
depends.
I mean, were lots of accounts written then?
Were lots of accounts written at the same time as Daniel?
Was Nebuchadnezzar one who valued an accounting of his?
Oh, did Nebuchadnezzar have records as well verifying this stuff? Is that what you're...
Or just even an account of history that came from Nebuchadnezzar's?
Yes, there's an account. There's several accounts, and especially what we have is victory monuments and things like that, accounting the victory of Nebuchadnezzar over Jerusalem that verifies this. The dating is different. Judah at this period was on the Egyptian calendar. Babylon has their own calendar and their own way of reckoning years. So the dating of the reign of like Jehoiakim is 1 year off because of that. But yes, we have records of this happening in other places. Yep. Now, the specific events in Daniel, some of them go unaccounted for in the Babylonian records. But yeah, we have at least of the siege and stuff like that. We have matching records. Okay. I think that's going to be it for today. I want to leave about 10 minutes because I need to go get this set up upstairs for our live stream. Any closing comments or questions that I can answer briefly for you? So next week, then, we'll dive into verses 3 through 7 and see how far we get. The goal, again, is to be done by Christmas. To get done by Christmas, most likely we'll move through the narrative, which means the stories of chapters 1 through 6. We're going to be moving through those at a good clip.
I
Okay.
remember maybe close to 50 years ago when there were a lot of studies on Daniel.
Yeah.
I wonder if it changed from that to today.
Have there been a lot of studies on Daniel? There were 50 years ago. You're commenting. Has that changed to today? Yes and no. Daniel's a very difficult book, especially with the visions. And we're going to see how we resolve some of those things as we go forward and what it means. It's also used quite a bit in New Testament prophecy. Daniel's all over the book of Matthew. It's all over the book of Revelation. It's repurposed, so has lasting impact, which then makes it, again, a difficult book to tackle because you have to look backwards, then you need to relate it forwards. What did it mean? What does it mean? What will it mean even today? There are still people who do it. It's a frequent study. How well it's done, who knows? How well we do it, who knows? God knows. But yeah, so I would say it's probably mixed. I think with apocalypticism in general, like the book of Revelation, there's been a lot of pullback from it. There's not as much teaching as even 10 or 15 years ago on it. Why? Because as people study and get into it, and as scholars get into it more, we just look at this and go, how can we teach this in 35 or 40 minutes? How can we do it in a sermon? It takes hours and hours and hours to capture some of these chapters and to work through it. Blessedly, we do have people who do just that. So I know that's a really roundabout and vague way of actually answering that question, but that'll be my answer for it. Alrighty, thank you so much, folks. Thanks for joining us online. Blessings to you all. Bye-bye. See you upstairs.